How is it going, guys? It's Epsilon and today's video is featuring this beast of a tier 10 heavy tank, and it is of course the VKK, and it's capable of dealing with some of the most dangerous tier 10 heavy tanks, and why this tank is more than likely one of the kings of tier 10. And you can see straight away getting into a nice position to get a free shot of damage onto the IS-7 as he's trying to angle correctly on the corner. So of course when you do get bored in the game in a tank like this, when you're in a tier 8 matchup, of course coming up against things like the T-34, you can work your magic off the German line to have decent accuracy for a heavy and push into some of the tanks like the IS-7, who's now decided he's going to try and reverse side scrape, which is not a bad strategy in that vehicle since you don't get the angled front of the pike nose. But unfortunately for the IS-7, this VKK knows exactly what to do in the beast of tier 10, and that is of course to push, which is a ideal scenario, especially when you're on Fission's Bay. You want to make sure that you can push forward, remove any of the vehicles that are going to be sat in this location like this VKP next, and therefore you can then push into the town, flank around the side and deal with things like the Tortoise and the rest of the tanks on this flank before the enemy team win the other side of the map, or if they do, and therefore you can deal with them by returning to the base or moving into the middle to get some free shots of damage, avoiding crossing the big open field towards where the TDs are, of course, to avoid getting taken out pretty quickly. Now of course already in this replay he's picked up 4,800 damage, which is perfect, exactly what you want at the beginning of the game, and he hasn't even taken a single shell, and in fact he's managed to block 2,200 hit points, and that is because the VKK, being the Clan Royal reward vehicle and very similar to of course the King Lerva, the Panzer 7, is having that reverse side scraping meta in terms of having the rear mounted turret. And although the rear mounted turret is not necessarily the best way to play the tank, since it does get weak points on the side of the vehicle which can be penned by premium rounds just below the turret ring essentially, and it is a very annoying weak point, especially when you are trying to side scrape, as it's the first point of contact that people will aim for, and if you get any ounce of the side of this tank then you can pen that quite reliably. But remember, this tank has 750 alpha with every single shell, so it has the same sort of gun as an E100, and that means that it is very dangerous if you're just sat out in front of this thing, especially if you're in something like a Soviet heavy that doesn't have the alpha damage to be able to trade effectively 1-for-1 with this vehicle. So it can be super annoying to come up against, and that's exactly why I feel like it's good to showcase this tank, because then you can know the weak points of it, as well as of course what to look out for when you are playing up against this tank. And if you can out reload it, then that is ultimately where you want to make sure that you are coming around and not taking any damage, avoiding the shells entirely, and then being very opportunistic, maybe tracking this thing and being able to avoid it from just going straight forward and making a beeline towards your hit point pool, as it will decimate it very quickly. And although this tank is not particularly the fastest, it's capable of moving forward and creating space just because it's able to bounce quite reliably when it is using its armor frontally. Although the lower plate is possible to be penned by a lot of heat rounds in the game, it isn't an easy pen, and you know, you do have to have that super high penetration, and often in a lot of the tier 8 and tier 9 games that you'll be meeting in a tier 10, you won't really have to worry about that all too much. Now there is of course a mantlet weak point as well, which can be penned with these vehicles, and the cupola weak point as well, but they are fairly difficult to hit and they're far less reliable than going for that side weak point here, especially when this thing is angling and using side scraping meta. So having won the town area, the last thing that you want to do is to be crossing the open field over here, since this is the basic kill zone for anyone that tries to push it, since there is often TDs camping in the bushes at the back, as well as TDs camping on the A and B 1, 2 and 3 line, which is essentially another way of you getting taken out pretty quickly. So taking the town area like you're seeing here and then pushing from this direction to finish up any tanks that might be in the center, and then getting the numerical advantage over your opponents to the point where, you know, you can just all go at once and they're never going to be able to deal with you all at the same time, and therefore you're going to come out with the win, which is ultimately what you want. And especially when you are playing a tank like this, you want to make sure that you are maximizing the damage, especially considering how well this tank is played. If you are looking to get marks of excellence on it, it is a Clan Wars reward tank, so of course the best players in the game are typically the ones that are going to be playing it, so trying to get 3 marks in this thing is very, very difficult, and you're going to have to compete with some of the best. Now hopefully you'll see here that he's been able to push forward, get some nice damage, and picked up nearly 10,000 damage already, which is perfect game so far, and it's been a fairly quick one to be able to pick up 10k damage, lasting about 8 minutes since the start of the battle, and primarily been fighting his way through everything and barely taken any damage, only now receiving shells. And of course the Su-130PM managing to land around into the side of the vehicle in that weak point, like I was saying, which is of course a very annoying place to be found. Now unfortunately for them, they do get spotted, and if you are the forward force in the game, when you are pushing this location at the end, if you do have the hit points to do so, you can end up getting extra assistance damage, which is what you want in a tank like this. Once again, if you are going for the marks, and why this tank is actually just superb at being that push through heavy, because it doesn't just get the flat plates that you're seeing with the Maus and the E100, other than that flat lower plate, but at the end of the day it is super thick as well, and it's probably harder to pen than the E100s anyway, so yeah, definitely a fantastic result. And the next replay that we do have today is of course on Redshire, and this is where you can really break through on this map and be able to dominate opponents in the area by the airship. And when you do push this location up against tanks like the Rain 50T, which don't really have the armor, up against that 350mm of heat pen that this tank gets, which is exceptional for a heavy tank, and really when you compare it to the standard penetration of this vehicle, which is pretty lackluster of 246, there's a real reason why a lot of the top tier players are firing heat, and it's not because they are of course top tier players, it's because if you don't fire it you're at a significant disadvantage, and it's capable, when you see it here, up against penning the lower plate of the Badger very reliably and easily. And yeah, you can really dominate when you are starting to use this thing in that aggressive position, as you've seen in both the first and the start of this game. Now unfortunately for the Badger, of course it can get the gun depression with its 7 degrees of gun depression to get into this position, and there's really nothing that the Badger can do, since it's going to be looking at the angled turret which basically hides the cupola, and the only real way is to try and pen that mantlet with super high penetration. But you know, when it's cresting the ridge with a minimal amount, it's really hard to do that, and unfortunately the enemy team just have not been able to do it reliably. Now typical breakthrough heavies don't usually have very slow speeds like 33 kilometers an hour that you're seeing with the King Lurva, and that is really where the VKK kind of lacks in that department. 33 kilometers an hour top speed, but that is really why it's imperative in these aggressive games, when you are coming up against tanks that are faster than you and you're wanting to get into the positions quick enough in the game so that you can deal with a lot of the opponents like you're seeing here. Turbo is almost always essential, or of course taking the enhanced mobility system so that you can get forward into those positions and really be able to contend with some of the faster heavies like the Soviet ones, things like the IS-7, etc. And that is really, really important to be able to use this tank correctly. And there's often a case for you using vertical stabilizers and rammer with this tank, so you want to have that good accuracy, the base accuracy of the vehicle being 0.38, which means that when you are up close and personal it's more than fine, but if you are put into that situation where you do need to reliably pen things at longer ranges, it just doesn't quite feel as accurate as maybe you would hope for. But doesn't really matter when you're at this sort of close range, and you can see the enemy tanks like the Super Conqueror and Badger really struggling to get any real shots into the VKK, and he's able to realistically hit them pretty much every time, unless you're trying to go for that cupola of the Conqueror, as you've been seeing. So for the keen-eyed of you, you'd have already seen that the enemy tanks have taken the western side of the map. So it's really crucial that this player right here manages to dominate this flank and be able to get forward to deal with some of these tanks like the Super Conqueror, the E75 TS, and of course the CC who hit him just a second ago. So then he can turn around and deal with those medium tanks who's going to be pressuring the cap, because no one wants to lose the cap. It is the worst thing in the game, is when you end up having a game like this and then end up losing to cap because you just genuinely couldn't get back. And when that is one of the extra problems of having that lower mobility, and yeah, not particularly the funnest in the game. Now unfortunately the E75 and the Maus are not able to get some reliable shells into the Super Conqueror, really help out at all when he's facing up against these three vehicles, as I'm sure you're well aware when you're seeing this tank being played as it is. But luckily, since he's above the Super Conqueror, it makes it easier to hit the Cupola, but still not perfect, as you're seeing him being able to bounce off the top of the tank, not actually aiming for the Cupola itself and trying to go for that frontal bit of the turret. Now hopefully he can connect a shell here. You're seeing here a very close shell, and he shuts down the Super Conqueror. Perfect. Now it's time to really press the advantage against his 703-2, who hopefully he'll be able to either side scrape or get the gun depression onto that turret of his to be able to remove him from the game. And since the 703-2 doesn't have the best turret in the game, he should be able to pen it, but he goes for the engine deck. Perfect shell there, exactly what you want. And now it's time to really press home the advantage on this other flank and secure some extra damage, having picked up 6,000 so far. So a really great game, as you can see. As we expected, they have got into the cap, or just left the cap. So it appears like the Centurion 7/1 was the one in the cap circle, and you can see that pretty much the entirety of the enemy team are spotted, and unfortunately his team are down by 2,000 hit points. But don't worry, because this tank can quite easily change that result, and you can see here a easiest shot that you could hope for against the Centurion 7/1 there. And unfortunately the CC is right next to him too, and that tank could be super dangerous if it can get the side of you or can land just one of those shells in its clip. And unfortunately for the CC, it doesn't appear like he's actually at home today, and he manages to connect one to the side of the turret, dealing another 780 damage. And chunking away hit points with this vehicle is so much fun, and really you can do the exact same thing in the King Löwe, and there is not a massive difference. I mean, this tank did get nerfed from what it originally had, since it did have that side scrape weak point that was stronger than the King Löwe, which yeah, isn't so much the case anymore, but it's still very dominant when you can use it correctly. Now the Cobra, a dangerous tank once again. You've got the CC who can one-shot you, the UDES who can also one-shot you nearly if he does high roll, and of course just making sure that you are connecting every single one of these last shells, and with the accuracy of 0.38 as space, yeah, it's not necessarily the easiest task you can hope for. But now he decides to push towards the CC, who's obviously out in the open. Another really nice shell. Great movement, and that's what you need to be doing with this tank, since you don't get the luxury of being able to move quickly with this vehicle, as we've already highlighted. And you can see here, and can you get the shell into the engine deck of the CC? Absolutely. Side armor is paper, and he shuts him down. Very nice shell. And now with just the Conqueror and the Centurion 7/1 left on the enemy team on pretty low hit points realistically, that he's able to shut down the Centurion in just one shell if he can connect it. And unfortunately for the Centurion, he is on his lonesome, and that is perfect, and he can push towards him now, coming down off of the hill and potentially getting a shell into the side of him. Can he manage to hit it without taking a shell? He doesn't manage to do it without taking a shell, but yeah, still a good amount of damage. And luckily the Centurion 7/1 was using the small gun, only managing to deal 240 damage. So brilliant result there, and of course exactly what you want when you are in this late game position. But it does now put him on a one shot against this Conqueror, and pushing into a hold down Conqueror is something you never want to have to do. But luckily for him, he's exposed on the hill, and he shuts a lovely round straight into him. And yeah, what a great result there, and now leaving the Conqueror on a potential one shot if he high rolls. But of course still a decent amount of hit points that he may not be able to finish him off in just one shell. But knowing if he goes over the ridge, he's going to be exposing the lower plate of the vehicle as he comes over, which is of course not what you want. You want to make sure that you are taking a position where you can try and make some use of gun depression and use only your turret armor. And he's got to land this shell into the Concrete. Doesn't want to bait the shell. He doesn't want to be baited. And there you go. The Conqueror manages to hit him in the lower plate by the looks of it. Or potentially the side over here. And shuts him down. But he did manage to do 11,500 damage and took out a 6 of the enemy team. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video looking at one of the kings of tier 10 heavies. Make sure to subscribe if you aren't already and check out these videos on screen for more.